Well, it's a good morning, and you're coming from the radiofm 88 studios in Springwood in Brisbane. Now, the reason we interrupted our normal programming is that it was brought to my attention several weeks ago by a gentleman called Ian Oliver. And Ian brought my attention to the fact that we have a federal by-election here in the seat of Fadden, and people are probably going to ask themselves, what has that got to do with our normal programming? Well, plenty, because there's been a lot of things that have taken place in the last 3 years that need to be addressed, and there's enough concerned citizens here in Australia who wish to put their hand up and say enough's enough. And so this particular gentleman, who's been the current member of this particular seat of Fadden, has chosen to resign. I'm not going to go into the reasons why, but it's one of the major reasons why people put their hand up and say enough's enough. And so Ian said that he was representing a seat of Fadden as the organiser, and the party he was representing was Australian Citizen Party, and we had a really good chat. And then he introduced me to their leader in Australia, and that gentleman rang me, and we had a chat, and I said, look, let's do something. And of course, that's why we're here on the airwaves today. And first of all, we have our gentleman down in Melbourne, sitting just below me, Robbie. And further down in the totem pole is Jan. So we're going to bring them on and introduce everybody, and then we'll start with Jan because it's really about macro and micro. So micro is where we're just dealing with the seat of Fadden and its constituents, and Jan's lives in the seat of Fadden. So, and then Jan's got an appointment to go to, and so she'll depart, and then Robbie and I will talk about the big picture that the Australian Citizens Party is all about, and what we've had a chat with just before we came on air. I suggest that you stay and watch, or you can share the show, because I think it's really justifiable for everyone in Australia to have listened to what's been said. Anyway, it's a good morning to everybody.
Morning, Jeff.
Morning, Jeff.
Right, so let's start with Jan.
Yep.
And okay, so we know that we've got a by-election coming up. We know it's coming up on Saturday, the 15th of July. It's tradition here for the booths to open at 8 a.m. to 6 p.m, depending on your time zone. And in this case, we're in Queensland, and we're just back to the normal. Well, we never jumped to daylight savings. So I see your office is at home.
Yep.
And that's the Nerve Centre, and you can refer to Robbie at any given time, I would have thought.
That's right.
And so I'll just go here. Okay, there you go. I've also noticed that on your website, you're the actual Queensland State Secretary as well. So it's assisted you to get mobilising with all your fellow members of the party. So let's bring us on board on how that all came about.
Just to put the record straight, I don't actually live in Fadden. I'm in Eagleby, which is bordering Fadden. You know, it's the closest suburb to the border. So Yatala down to Nerang, but doesn't include Nerang. So the Fadden electorate is just below me, mostly to the east of the Pacific Motorway. And I just thought it was a great opportunity to bring the ideas that I've been promoting on behalf of the Citizens Party. We do a lot of community service by organising and educating the population on how we've got to get out of a new Great Depression. We're like ahead of the curve. We know the directionality that the country's going in, and we need to change the banking system in Australia in order to take responsibility for the people into the future. You know, it's not just about having a good time now. It's about what are we doing so that our children and grandchildren have a greater opportunity to do well, you know, and make our lives worth living for the future for them. And I got involved with the Citizens Party, not because I was already in politics, but because, like a lot of people, you know what you don't like, but you don't really, until I met the Citizens Party, I didn't know what to fight for, or how do you create jobs? You know, you just don't want any old jobs. You want full-time, meaningful, well-paid, skilled work that is productive, that will make a difference. And it's the kind of things that I've learned over the years that the old Labor Party fought for: a living wage, and the certainty of better conditions for our future generations. That's the kind of language they used in the old days. And for instance, the Commonwealth Bank, when it was in government hands, despite everybody hating government, they hate the banks, but a government bank driven by the people, as in the people have to demand of their government this institution to be used for the good. So that's our role in the Citizens Party, is to organise and educate and activate the population to get involved instead of, being comfortable whinging. Participate in the process and make a difference. And so that's our main policy. And it's not just a wish. It's we have legislation for a government bank of different kinds, like a post office bank, a national bank, an infrastructure bank, mostly because if a government has the will to develop the nation, then they need a means to do that. You know, you just can't rob Peter and pay Paul like we've been doing for the last nearly 40 years since the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank. So you do need a bank, a government bank, but you also need a government with the courage to take on the interests of the private banks and stand up and say, we're going to use this institution. Like the RBA is government owned but privately controlled. It could be government controlled, but the government is too weak to stand up to the interests of the private banks. So, the Citizens Party is non-compromising on this. It's our non-negotiable fighting platform, that's the language of the old Labor Party as well. It was non-negotiable. This the original Commonwealth Bank that started in the post offices was the means to sovereignty. The government can't govern, as John Curtin said, coming out of the Banking Royal Commission of 1937-38. The government can't govern but to a secondary degree if it doesn't control its own bank. Hasn't got control of its banking. So how's that for an introduction?
Good, mate. All right. So I see we've got 11 candidates that put their hand up for this particular by-election.
13, actually. 13 candidates.
13, is it?
Yeah, and I'm 11th in the draw.
So. Oh, yes, that's right. There we go. Yeah, so it's not that many. The only person or two people would be number 1, the Labor Party candidate, and number 4, the Pauline Hanson One Nation. There's no one else who's ever stood before it. What was really interesting is Clive Palmer's party's not there, eh?
It's all hot air.
I am surprised by that, but I don't think Clive Palmer's party is a real party, to be honest.
He uses it for leverage. It's like he's negotiating at a poker table, isn't he?
It's a rich vanity project.
Yeah. Okay, so there you are, number 11 there, Jan. Yeah, Australian Citizens Party.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the crux to all this is obviously we learnt that some years ago when the guy did all the strategy planning for micro parties, and he worked out all the preferences and all that stuff. That's another part of the whole gambit of the political game, is you put your cornflute signs up, you get your flyers out there, and then you got to sort of say, well, you might get first past the post, but have you got anybody backing you and supporting you? So are you liking that part of the game here to get across the line? Because it's really awkward, isn't it, when you have to do the horse trading, eh?
No, I don't like that at all. And we should have a different system where, the person who gets the most votes wins. but that's not the system. So the Citizens Party doesn't do deals. If other, like what I do, and I encourage other people to do, is call or meet with other candidates and find out where they stand on the important things, and then later we can worry about how we part our hair on the issues that are not so important. So at the
it's like any marriage, isn't it? Eh? It's like any marriage. You got the art of compromise. Sometimes the compromise is not the best.
Well, that's right. Well, we don't compromise. For instance, this is my 9th candidacy. So I've run 9 times for the Citizens Party. If I just wanted to get in and get elected, I'd go join a major party because they do get people elected, right? So I've stuck with the Citizens Party because of their policies, and it's a political party that organises all year. So we don't just ramp it up because, they've called an election and we've got 3 weeks to go, right? So 3 weeks is not any time at all to get the population on board. If it was just if it was all driven by, how many call flutes you get up and how many flyers you get out, well, there's no certainty that the people will vote for you that way. We don't have the benefit of mainstream media. So what I've done 3 weeks ago when I became aware that Stuart Robert was resigning from Fadden, the Citizens Party, our organisation in Melbourne, it's a real phone team driven contact with people throughout Australia who are supporting my candidacy. And like, for instance, I got a call yesterday from a guy in Sydney, a supporter who's a former mayor, not of Sydney, but of a region down there, who's going to fly up and stay at my place and help me, like, be my right-hand man for going organising. And it's great to have that support and teamwork. But you've also got the phone team in Melbourne who are getting support from people all over Australia with a focus on Fadden. So instead of us organising, when I say organising, I mean politically organising the minds of the population, whether it be on the Sunshine Coast or Toowoomba or Northern New South Wales, we're getting our activists to come in to the electorate of Fadden and participate. And they do that by door knocking, letterboxing, having literature tables. We've got, I'm getting signs for a trailer sign so that we can do an old fashioned fun way while people are door knocking. There could be, like, some people are not as able bodied as others. And so you've got to think, how can they be involved? And so usually they can drive a car and they can spruik, from the passenger side and introduce our ideas over the megaphone. And it does create an atmosphere where people go, what's going on, or I saw you guys on the street, or I heard you guys, or I got something in the mail, or, I'm a teacher at the school and they learnt of our campaign. So it's all these different ways of intersecting that we're concentrating, in the Fadden electorate.
Everybody's heard green sleeves as Mr. Whippy Truck's gone around the Australia. Still in England, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, in the past we've played classical music, which is, something unique, I think, to our party. And I love wearing this jacket there. It's on the back of my jacket with Mona Lisa there, because we've got to enrich people with beauty and truth. And that's what will cut through all the rhetoric and lies or people's cynicism. You can't change anything. You'll never do it. The machine's too big. They're too powerful. Well, nothing will ever be changed by people who think like that. What we've got to our advantage is their demise. Like, the banking system is rotten to the core. 2008, the GFC was an indicator that it could have been changed then, when there was a global financial crash. Instead of going through the process of a just, orderly bankruptcy reorganisation. They didn't. They kicked the can down the road by bailing out the banks. So, and printing money like no tomorrow, and the banks got a free ride, and all those chickens are coming home to roost because it's not just a housing bubble, there's a giant derivatives bubble, which is magnitudes greater than in 2008. And when that crashes, we don't want to wait for that. That's why we're promoting not just a national bank, but the principle of national banking is what Franklin Roosevelt did in 1933. He separated commercial banking from investment banking. So where people held their savings, their deposits, they were secure in a government bank like our Commonwealth Bank. And if you wanted to gamble and make some money by speculating, then you can put it in the casino. So when the casino crashes, your deposits are safe, right? So that Glass-Steagall banking system that we had from, and I say we, even though that was in America, they called it Glass-Steagall, but world trades in American dollars, and there was an agreement, the Bretton Woods post-World War II agreements that fixed currencies to gold, and it was illegal to speculate on a nation's currency. They had fixed exchange rates and currency controls and laws against usury and speculation. So for 66 years, Australia was part of that fixed exchange rate system until 1971. So we did have a system that worked where there wasn't these financial bubbles. People could raise a family on one wage. We've got to take back responsibility, and government has to be responsible for the general welfare, and they can do that by nationalising utilities, for instance. So we haven't, so that people can get on with their lives, have a job, do their work, be proud of the family they're raising, and be proud that they're contributing. They may not think of themselves as contributing to the whole, but the government's got to provide the means for people to be able to live and be happy. They shouldn't be struggling, even though it may be a struggle. It usually is a struggle when raising a family and staying married. But it's a joy at the same time because you're working for the future, and it's the government's role to provide that means for those wheels to turn, and whether they realise it or not, whether the population realise it or not, they're doing something good. Whereas if the government just lets the banks run the world or run Australia, it's a race to the bottom, and people are struggling without that opportunity to provide for their families. And people are not even having families now. If you're young, you're putting it off because it's too hard to make a living, let alone pay off a house and raise some children.
You're entering an interesting spot there. I mean, people who live in Fadden or any place in Australia, or even over New Zealand or in the UK or America, it's cost of living. So what you're proposing seems to be, what would you call it? The fix, is that what? You're actually providing a remedy for cost of living pressures by saying, okay, we have a problem with our financial markets, let's rectify that, and then let's look and we'll talk about it later with Robbie, the bigger picture about the jobs and Ben Chifley and John Curtin's long-term vision. We seem to have a short-term vision in Australia, so you're actually proposing people who are watching the show and those in the seat of Fadden start realising, oh, okay, there is a solution here, there is a remedy, and Jan and her political party are running up a flag to say, hello, there is an option here. Let's have a good look at this. Yeah, is that what I'm hearing from you today?
There's not a local solution for Fadden. It has to be a national solution, because whether your hospital's closing down or, they might be, not building, for instance, the railway, tramways or what do they call it? Anyway, whatever it is, it's not good enough. The trams that they're putting in. Why aren't we having elevated trains? from the Gold Coast to Brisbane, or even we haven't even got a train from the Coolangatta airport to Brisbane. It just makes no sense. But it's a reflection of making no sense all around the country. There's just there's no solutions locally because the problems are national. It's like when in the Great Depression in Australia from 1929 to 39. We suffered the depression for 10 years unnecessarily, because even though we had a government bank, it wasn't used. The politicians were too weak to stand up to the private banks. They did not inflate the currency to direct credit into nation building infrastructure. So this is why I'm standing up, because I am prepared to do what it takes to put the solutions on the table, and the banks have got to be re-regulated, and by establishing a post office people's bank, like the old Commonwealth Bank started in the post offices, it's an immediate moratorium on the bank's hegemony, the private bank's hegemony. It will mean that government can be responsible again and have a means, if they've got a vision, they can use the credit from a government bank. Federal, state and local governments could be encouraged to bank in it, like rates, things like you take for granted when you pay your rates money, or you're contributing to your superannuation or the pension funds. These are all in the private banking system that gambles with your deposits, with those deposits. And there's no security in that, because the stock market goes up and goes down. When you retire or when you need that money, it may not be there, and that's not fair. By having a government bank, and we've written legislation for this. So in the charter of the new Post Office People's Bank, there's no gambling with people's deposits. It's there for nation building purposes, not building casinos or football stadiums, right? So yeah, we've got to get back to productivity and manufacturing, and Robbie can go into more on those kinds of things later.
How can I ask a question? How are the locals in Fadden receiving your message, Jan?
Well, consistent with the rest of the population around Australia, they love the idea of a post office bank. It's like 99% of the people support it because we have a petition. If they like the idea, please sign the petition. So we've been going to businesses and with the petition also, and flyers. So they're putting our posters. So we've got this flyer here, which that's got the Post Office Bank, no war with China, no AUKUS. Okay, they're the main. They're the main policies there, and they've embraced them. They're putting these on the windows, or we're putting them up in their windows for them, but they're happy to do that. The locals, yeah, they recognise you've got to do something for the nation as well. So, yeah, our supporters like going organising because, they're confident this is the solution. It's a tried and proven bank that we had for 84 years in Australia. The Commonwealth Bank was in government hands for 84 years before it was privatised. And in that time, we built the infrastructure of the nation from 1911 until it was sold off in 1996. All right, this country wasn't built by private industry, even though you have private banks. They might, private industry, they might build private schools and private hospitals, but and private nursing homes and so forth. But the government's got to set the standard, and we did once. Yeah, we did once set the standard, but now you've got, government that's outsourced everything, is virtually not responsible for anything.
If I'm not mistaken, for a global audience there, we had the Federal Labor Party was under Bob Hawke at the time, and it was through the Labor Party there that decentralised the whole banking system and opened it up and privatised it. If we go back to Jimmy Carter, he was the one that removed the gold standard at $32 an ounce, made it free floating, in order to protect the printing of all the American dollars. So And then we've had in the Queensland Labor Party, when they removed the power out of the hands of the Queensland government and privatised it, and then we saw the price of electricity rise. We've seen the same with the water in Queensland. And of course, we had the Cyclone Debbie. Was it the Cyclone Debbie in 2011? And the water just kept on coming and coming. And then when they opened up the floodgates at the Wivenhoe Dam, it was 120% and caused 88 suburbs in Brisbane to get flooded. And, you know, I mean, a lot of times privatisation is not really the way to go, isn't it?
No way. They've got privatised prisons now, and, you know, they focus on, you know, these young kids doing wheelies or stealing cars, which is bad enough. But I got an old friend, Dick Thies, who's 85. He said, or 86. He said, we used to lair rise on horseback. Like, you're not going to stop young people lair rising, but, you know, if they today it's like deadly, and we've got to provide a future for them. They're born into this collapse, and we have to make sure that they have opportunity to, you know, use their creativity and in positive ways.
So federally, I mean, we've got 3 different levels of government here in Australia. I mean, just for our global audience, we have our federal government, and you can see the map of Australia. And then we've got individual states, and then we've got our local councils. So we've got these 3 levels of government. So everybody's after a piece of the cake out of your hip pocket of your weekly wage. So they're all taking their percentage. What can you do for the people of Fadden at this moment in time?
Well, we've got to grow the pie. It's only fixed because we're not developing. We have to grow the economy. So there has to be investment into productive things. So government can, if we had a government bank, it's not that money isn't fixed. Like, banks create money out of thin air. A government bank could do the same thing, right? They can increase it by 10 times or 100 times. It's not inflationary if it goes into productive means. For instance, I'm just trying to think, in Fadden, for instance, you've got the M1 going through, and everyone knows that's a death trap. You know, it just takes one person to have a crash, and the whole economy just grinds to a halt, and it's just terrible. And everybody else around Australia thinks, you must be insane to live in Brisbane because of the traffic problem on the M1. So we should, if we were developing inland, directing credit into high-speed rail, for instance, ring rail going through agriculture and mining areas right around the country. Like I say, there's no solution inside Fadden for the problems that Fadden has. You've got to provide the means for the whole nation to develop, so that we decentralise in a productive way and bring back manufacturing. So by using the infrastructure corridors of high-speed rail, gas pipelines, fibre optics, water projects, so all around the rail line, you create new towns and cities, then encourage people to go there. I used to live in Mackay, and my husband worked at Queensland Health, and he was given a good wage to move, like a better wage to live out in the regions from Brisbane, to move there, because they want to encourage people. They want to encourage these professional services where usually the services are low. And since COVID, for instance, we have not done that. We haven't built new hospitals. We could be, with the infrastructure of high-speed rail, it links the whole nation. It unites families that are otherwise, separated by the tyranny of distance, as it's known. So it's crucial that, we build these water projects and power stations outside the capital cities, not just cram people into the existing infrastructure that our forefathers built for us when we had a government bank. They're just creating one problem after another. So that would help alleviate in a large way the problems that we have in Fadden.
Okay.
Also, if I can chip in here, our party was instrumental in getting up the current federal Senate inquiry into bank closures, banks closing their branches all over the places. Now, it's focused. It has a regional focus, but it's a universal problem. They're closing just as many in metropolitan areas. And I was at a hearing in Cloncurry, and the locals made a really important point, which is that the banks should be criticised for withdrawing services, but in many cases, they're just copying what governments are doing. And because governments are also withdrawing services, and people in the real world, in real communities, are finding it harder and harder to access services. It's not just bank branches that are closing. Australia Post wants to close post offices, and lots of other services are harder and harder to access. And the governments justify this, Jeff, because, of finances, right? They've got to consolidate their finances. What we're proposing with our banking solution is actually how the government can get its finances in order so that it can keep its commitment to services, right? The objective is not a balanced budget. The objective is good finances while serving the community. And our policies will make a difference to every community, including absolutely the people of Fadden, right? So they know that they got more local services. They don't have to get trapped on the M1 to go, farther afield as much as they do now. That sort of thing, right? This is you have a universal prescription for the economy that will make a big difference locally to every community.
Well, we've seen that with the advent of national broadband, isn't it? I mean, it's third quality. I mean, you go over to New Zealand, it's 1 gigabyte.
Yeah. Shameless.
I mean, so the 3 years that we just talked about, that what Jan just spoke about, which we all went through, how many people left prison Victoria?
Not
mean,
me.
Yeah. 60,000 inmates left prison Victoria to move New South Wales and Queensland. So, but the thing we saw is businesses actually started to remote and use TeamViewer and all these other products where people could no longer, they didn't have to live in the city in their cages. When I say cages, I'm talking about their high-rise apartments. They can now vacate and move in to smell the oxygen and see the sunrise and all that stuff because they had internet to be able to interact with people. So it seems to be when Peter Costello set up the Future Fund, that finance could have been put into investing into that superhighway of optic fibre that Jan previously mentioned.
Instead, it's invested in the stock markets around the world.
Well, every pension fund all around the world has gone and done that, haven't they?
Yep.
I mean, Thames Water has been bought and sold 7 times, to my knowledge. Yep.
So that money could be being invested in the things that make us stronger as a nation, the long-term infrastructure. Instead, it goes in things like privatized infrastructure that then you're told that the bargain is you need to be screwed today by this private utility so that you have a slightly bit more, your super fund can profit, so you have a bit more in your retirement. But sure. Of course, they'll still be screwing you then. So we've got to change the whole system. And the other thing that our pressing concern is that if we don't actually face up to it, we'll make this whole discussion a moot point, is the normalising of talk of war with China, Jeff. And I think that's relevant to literally every community in Australia, because if we don't pull back on that and go, well, what are we talking ourselves into? You can see in Ukraine how quickly a war can start, right? These things are not just academic exercises, and every community will be absolutely affected by that. And that's the other thing I wanted to ask Jan. How's that message resonating in Fadden, Jan?
Well, it's a no-brainer. Like, nobody wants war with anybody. So, it's just, you don't need to have a big discussion about it. It's just obvious. And
good.
I think I did meet one person that was pro-war with China. I won't tell you what political party they're in, but I didn't bother discussing it. I think how insane. It's not a war that we can win. Could lead to nuclear war because Australia has got a target on ourselves with Pine Gap and American troops in Darwin and elsewhere. So, Australia should have an independent foreign policy. That's what I say, which is what former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser has said in his book, Dangerous Allies. And also recently, Paul Keating has come out saying we need an independent foreign policy. So even though I didn't like Keating and Fraser in the day, one Liberal politician, one Labor, but they're still just as bad as each other today, as parties. But in their elder statesmen like older wiser moment, they've come out saying this independent foreign policy, and that's exactly right. We lose our sovereignty by jumping on the shirt tails of the UK and the US with this nuclear sub deal and AUKUS. Everyone agrees with that.
Good.
Hey, everybody knows about Machiavelli politics. If you haven't got an enemy, you create one. So, yeah, it's all about divide and rule. So people just can see through the smoke screen. I mean, if one looks at Mr. Donald Trump, for example, he's the only one who never actually took America into war. In fact, he actually took them out of wars, whether it be the ISIS Syria situation or diffuse the situation in North Korea. I mean, the Americans only won one war, and that was when Ronald Reagan sent 5,000 troops into Grenada on a little island. These guys, the military-industrial complex, just perpetuate ongoing dramas. Yeah, I'm just saying.
And remember the hysteria in America and around the world about Trump when he said he wants to get on with North Korea. He said nice things about Kim Jong-un so he could actually do a deal. The whole place had a meltdown. Oh, no, because the system is geared, the way this military-industrial complex works, it's geared to profit from the constant threat of war. And these people do not want peace. They just don't. And that whole system, we have to have a long, hard look at ourselves and realize that whole system's got to change. It absolutely has to change, or else one day it'll go too far, and then that's a second later, we'll all regret not taking a stronger stand on this.
Now, we're here. We started a bit early because Jan mentioned that she had to get away at 9:30. So it's 9:30 now, Jan, and I'm just giving you, as a teacher, you can leave the class now.
Okay. Yeah.
Jan.
Thanks, Jeff. See you, Robbie.
See you, boss.
We
call it captain.
I'll exit. Cheers.
Okay,
bye.
you're on the Huskins. You're on the Huskins. We understand you have to leave.
Yeah. Go campaign. Go forth and campaign.
All right.
Go forth and multiply votes.
Kicked her out. Right. Let's get into the macro, mate, the big picture stuff. So, I mean, Jan alluded to that when she was talking about it. But you actually, as the, you're the Victorian nominated Senate candidate, aren't you? And you're also the spokesperson for the Australian Citizen Party. So you have the opportunity to bring a global audience and a national audience about Australian Citizen Party. I mean, when I was reading the brief, I thought to myself, you guys are really the original Labor Party. You know, there they are sitting under the tree of knowledge and bringing all the representatives from all over Australia on horseback and by boat and, into Canberra or into Sydney at the time or Melbourne until they decided they're going to set up in Canberra. And at one stage there's going to be the Port of Eden is going to be the location. But anyway, things are as we've gone to Canberra and we had people who weren't lawyers. These people came from all walks of life and brought all their knowledge and wisdom of what it's like to live in Australia. And these early pioneers really set the train in motion. So when I read your brief about Ben Chifley and John Curtin. I mean, the Labor Party just has lost track of all its heritage and its roots into why it became a great particular political party. I was mesmerised by the fact that you guys seem to be the original party.
Well, let me tell you a story about that. In 2002, our party took out a full-page advertisement in the Australian newspaper calling for a national bank based on the original Commonwealth Bank, which the original Labor Party had started. And we had hundreds of people sign this ad, and then their names were in the paper. And they included people from the whole spectrum of politics and positions. So you had people on there who were local councillors, you had people there who were secretaries of unions, and you had former politicians and some current politicians. One of those formers was Jim Cairns. You remember Jeff, who was the treasurer for a while under
Dr.
Whitlam. And Clyde, so it's Jim. I remember Jim Cairns and Clyde Cameron, the Labor minister under Whitlam, both signed that. And these were true old Labor people. Now Cairns copped a lot of bad press in his time, but he was a very, very thoughtful guy, and he was also the guy in the Whitlam government who knew they didn't have to borrow from overseas because they could have used the Reserve Bank as the national bank and fund the Buy Back the Farm program and the infrastructure agenda here. Didn't have to go and get Middle Eastern money, right? But I probably did the last interview he ever gave before he passed away, and he said that there was no stomach for it, even in the Whitlam government, because of what had happened to Ben Chifley 23 years earlier. Because when Ben Chifley really took on the banks, right, then Labor was smashed by the combined power of the banks, and they were out of office for 23 years, and they were quite scarred by this. And but he knew this was Labor losing its nerve, and they should have done what Chifley had done, right? But they didn't do it. And then, of course, the rest is history. But one of probably my biggest regret in my time in politics is Jim Cairns was very old then, sent me a note. And he said, Robbie, I think the Citizens Party is the modern flag bearers of the old Labor Party. That's what he thought, as someone who was from the Labor Party and joined at the time of the old Labor Party. Because the modern Labor Party, well and truly, has lost their way. And you're not kidding, they're all lawyers. I go into Parliament House a lot, mate, and they are pretty much all lawyers. And there was an event that happened at the end of last year that I think epitomises everything that's wrong with the Labor Party, and it would have had all the original founders rolling over in their graves, which was that in November last year, the Labor government had agreed finally to implement a recommendation of the Banking Royal Commission, which was that executives of banks who were responsible for their bank's misbehaviour and abuse of customers and misconduct, not just the banks should be held accountable, but the executives should be personally held accountable, right? They should be personally subjected to fines for that behavior. If they are the responsible entity in the bank, they should have been fined. This was a recommendation of the Royal Commission, because otherwise, you know how these corporations work. They have short-term management that's focused on short-term maximising of profits for shareholders. So the management come in and out. And by the time the Royal Commission was called in 2018, Jeff, most of the actual offenders of those banks had moved on, right? The bank executives who came and testified at the Royal Commission, very few of them were actually involved in most of the wrongdoing, right? That's the system. So how do you hold these banks accountable? So the Labor government finally agreed to do that in November last year. And this should have been a no-brainer for a Labor government. Everyone, remember all the complaints after the GFC, no banker went to jail? Yeah. This was finally a step in that direction. Your former Premier, Anna Bligh, who is now the head of the Banking Association, called up the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, who lives near you there, called up the Assistant Treasurer, Stephen Jones, Minister for Financial Services, that night and said, you're not going to do this. And the next day they changed their mind and they backflipped because the Labor government jumped to the tune of the banks. Whereas the old Labor Party, that was the hill they died on. They fought for decades and decades. They forced the banks to change. They took the power off the banks, and this is what they stood for. So yeah, anyone who knows that history knows that that's what the Citizens Party is. Because unless you have, it's the ultimate power. The banks have this enormous power. The old Labor Party called the money power, and it comes down to who controls that power. And if it's entirely private, then that power will be used for abuse, and just it'll be used to maximize profits, but that will be abusive and detrimental to the country. It must be, the ultimate power must be where in the hands of the government. So you can still have private banks, but the government must be the final authority. That's what the 1936 Royal Commission said, so that power can be constrained and banking can be used for the good. And that's what our party is the loudest voice for in Australia.
Hey, God, we could talk about the subject in depth. I was in London in the bombings 2007.
Yeah.
Anyway,
no, sorry, 2005. 7th of July 2005. They called them the 7/7 bombings. Yep.
And we got a 2-day pass to go around the city of London and hop off bus. So we'd done the first day, and we were staying at the Strand Hotel, and we walked down to the embankment to get back onto the next bus to do this second day. And the first bomb went off, and then the guy who's been the tour guide said, "Look, there's been a bomb. It sounds like a second bomb's gone off. Looks like we'll have to close down." So I got my partner and I, and we booked out of the hotel, and you couldn't get a cab. All of a sudden, couldn't get a cab, couldn't get a bus, couldn't get the tube. So walking across town, and then my mobile phone, my mate just kept ringing me up. I said, "What's going on?" It'd be cutting off. So I ended up going into an O2 shop to say, "Look, my phone's playing up." And the guy said, "Yep, there's been 4 bombs. Come over here and have a look." And there's 3 guys in suits came over, and we're watching live what was going on. And all those spots were all taking place the day before we had gone to all those locations. Yeah. Now, one of those guys stood back, and we had an hour and a half conversation. And I'm talking to the chairman of the London Chamber of Commerce. I'm talking to the guy who's the security counsel for Premier Blair.
Right.
Bloke comes to Australia to brief all our security intelligence organisations. I'm listening to the guy who's a member of the Conservative Party for the City of London. Then he gives me the whole rundown how the Rothschilds with Nathan got that 1 square mile of the top 20 banks in the world who can lend out $1.40 times. And he's given me the history. And I thought to myself, how many minders would I've had to go through to meet these 3 gentlemen? You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yep.
So the banking industry is there in our psyche, but to tell you the truth, there was a TV show that was a world phenomenon called The Game of Thrones. And in there we saw the Iron Bank.
Yeah, that's right.
And we saw the Lancasters, and the Lancasters represented the 5 Eyes. Yeah, and we saw how the Iron Bank would finance the Lancasters because the Lancasters would then give them money back, which is, like how America goes into a country and then capitulates their currency and then puts in their stooge operators and then puts the money back in place, and then they make their 99 cents in the dollar, which pays for the war. Yeah. So the banking industry has a lot to be desired, and it's interesting how Bob Hawke, decentralized all the banking systems, and we saw the Citibank try to come in here with AMP, and we saw everybody else trying to get in here and get a piece of the action. But the Commonwealth Bank kept everybody honest, didn't it? So I've noticed that in the National Bank's been closing branches throughout local suburbs and transferring across to the post office. So I'm hearing you, and I'm hearing the fact that the post office is still is that still in Australian public hands, or is that private?
No, it's still in Australian hands and it's still publicly owned, but it's on a model that is fragile because it was corporatized, right, in the late 80s, again by Labor. And so they have a community service obligation. They're required to maintain a minimum number of post offices around Australia. And there's now more post offices in Australia, by the way, than all bank branches combined. All branches of all banks combined have fewer branches than the 4,400 post offices and postal outlets in Australia. But those are expensive, and so they've got this obligation to maintain them as a service to the public. But they're also told by the government, you must operate commercially at a profit. And so that sets up this tension between making a profit and maintaining the service. And that's where the government hopes, and certainly the Liberal government beforehand, but Labor, the same people in Labor that privatised everything in the 90s, they'll happily privatise Australia Post if they could. Not everyone in Labor. There's a lot of people in Labor we're dead set against it, but there's a faction in Labor that would. And the Liberals have always wanted to privatise Australia Post, and then that'd be the ultimate disaster if that happened. But they want people to think, okay, the post office is dysfunctional, let's privatise it. Well, there's two alternatives to that. One is get rid of this corporatisation model and just go back to funding it as a government service, as it probably should be. So that's one approach. We have a win-win solution because we want to bring back essentially what the Commonwealth Bank was, right? And as Jan mentioned, it started in post offices. It actually, King O'Malley, the great American Labor visionary who was responsible for the Commonwealth Bank, he envisaged it as a post office bank, and then it quickly expanded beyond the post offices. So you could bring back a public bank, a retail bank, the People's Bank, and the quickest way to set it up would be through post offices, and it's cheapest, right? So with probably less than $1 billion, considering all the money the government's been shelling out for everything lately, right? $1 billion is not much. You could set up a competitor to the big four banks that would be able to beat them at their own game. It'll be quickly the biggest bank in Australia because every post office would be a branch of that bank. The revenue from banking services would make the post offices financially viable for all time and make sure the other services they provide can also be funded, right? And so you can have, in the remotest part of Australia, guaranteed banking services and postal services for all time through this model. That's the record of postal banks around the world. So Australians need to think that through, because what if it's bad enough losing your bank branch, you know, when you used to where your NAB branches or whatever, and then one day you go there and it's gone, it's a real inconvenience. Imagine if that started happening to post offices, because that's what's on the cards for Australia. If Australia Post starts closing post offices, and you're losing more services that way, imagine the knock-on effect of all that. Whereas with our policy, we could quickly solve both problems straight away. And then, as we always add in terms of our policy, Jeff, our policy would actually provide real competition for the banks. And that competition would actually stop them from closing their branches. They would be motivated to keep their branches open. In fact, I'm predicting they'll reopen branches they've already closed, because there's no good reason for them to close those branches in the first place. And you mentioned NAB. I'll just add this in conclusion. One of the things we've caught NAB doing is this regional banking inquiry asked all the banks to pause their branch closures. NAB just point blank refused and said, no, we're not pausing. So they're not used to, they don't think the government's an authority over them, right? They think they're an authority over the government. So they just point blank refuse. They're not pausing. And they're actually using the branch closures to count towards their goals for net zero carbon dioxide emissions. But think about what that means. They shut a branch where the locals can go a few blocks to their branch. They shut that branch. Does that mean the locals automatically just go, oh, okay, we're never going to visit a branch again, we're going to do online banking? No. There's a reason the locals had to go. If they were going to do online banking, they already would have been doing it. There's a reason they've gone to that branch. That means they've got to go further. They've got to get in their car. They've got to turn on the engine, and out of the exhaust pipe is coming carbon dioxide emissions. right? And so that NAB can pretend it's a good global citizen and it's got its carbon dioxide emissions down. It is forcing up Australia's carbon dioxide emissions. The whole thing's a scam. And that's where, when you see banks behaving like that, no mercy, mate. The government has to step in and just bring them to heel.
Okay, so come back to the number of elected representatives that they're all university graduates who happen to be lawyers, yeah, or they've come through the union movement. My best mate's son was handpicked by Labor Party, Liberal, and the National Party to be their candidate, with the proposal of being in a safe seat and then go through to become a minister. They had him earmarked at the age of 23, 24. And my mate just shakes his head and says, look, you know, he just put his hand up and walked away, so I can't believe it. But we come back to the early days of Federation, where all those train drivers or just farmers, you know, shearers, they had life skills, isn't it? We're not seeing those type of people in our parliament. And so, but even then, when you get into those two major parties, I'm going to put the National Party out of that gambit, but it's all about numbers, isn't it? It's like you've been a young kid and you say, oh, pick Robbie because his dad's going to take us to McDonald's after the game.
Yeah, that's right.
So you pick up your tribe. So, and it's really, really frustrating. And then you see how Game of Thrones infiltrated the psyche of this whole global population, and people, without realizing, were getting subtly told what's actually being played out here. But the last season was just shit. But everything leading up to it,
I agree with you,
led to that particular point, isn't it? So, so now we come back to Singapore, for example. When you get a job, you sign up for superannuation, then you go to that superannuation company, and then you borrow that for your apartment, and then you just keep putting money into it. So it becomes a way of maintaining your finance and keeping, you know, a little sand islands, because that's all they were, sand islands that were given to them by the Malaysian because of the opportunity of the Chinese to take over Malaysia. So they cut a deal and said, you can have the bottom part of Singapore, or what is now Singapore. And you can see how industrious the Chinese were to be able to create a financial and shipping transportation hub. You know, we don't seem to see that in Australia with our short-term policies. And yet, if it's not mistaken, is it John Curtin or Ben Chifley created the Snowy Mountain River Scheme?
Ben Chifley, that was launched in 1948. And can I say, I did the stats on this a couple of years ago, actually in 2020, because we were saying, look, COVID's hit and everyone's suddenly acknowledging that Australia doesn't manufacture enough for itself, right? Something we've been saying forever. And suddenly we see how vulnerable we are to these global supply chains. And we said, well, that's because we gave away the means for investing in those sort of things ourselves, and we've cannibalized ourselves. And I use the example of the Snowy Mountain Scheme. I think our public debt today, Jeff, is roughly 40% of GDP, and it's on its way to 50%. That's the government's debt. Now that seems like a lot, but Japan's, for instance, is 220% of GDP, they can handle that because they have a postal bank, by the way. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But the greatest level of public debt in Australian history was at the end of World War II, and it peaked at 140% of GDP, public debt, 140% of GDP. But it didn't crush us for two reasons. One was, similar to Japan, most of the debt was owed to the people of Australia. They were the war bonds that the people of Australia were encouraged to buy during the war, right? So the government was borrowing from their own people, which means when you're servicing that debt, the money's staying in the country. It's circulating here. And that's what the Japanese do. They have the biggest public debt in the world, but 98% of it is owed to the people of Japan. And they just keep servicing, they're paying their bonds, and that money's staying there. And they borrowed it from the postal bank. The people in Japan, it's one of the biggest banks in the world, Japan Post Bank. The people of Japan put their money in there, and the Japanese government borrows it. right, for its development. And it was the driver of its post-war economic miracle, the Japan Post Bank. I did an interview a couple of years ago with the former deputy of the director of the Ministry of Finance of Japan, and he explained to me, he said the thinking of Japan Post Bank started in the 1870s. The reason the Japanese set it up is because they saw all these other countries in Asia that were dealing with Europe, and the Europeans are coming and trading with all of them, but they're getting them into debt. And when they got them into debt, then they come back and invade, right? And the Japanese in the 1870s said, "No, we don't like this idea of getting into white man's debt." so they set up Japan Post Bank. Think about that in terms of sovereignty, etc. But yeah, so here we have the biggest debt in our history in 1948. It peaked in 48. And that year they announced the Snowy Mountain Scheme, which was a project, the cost of which was 15% of GDP. 15%. That is the equivalent today of Albanese getting up and saying, we're going to build an infrastructure project that costs $300 billion. Now, the Bradfield scheme in North Queensland, above your head there, that's about a $15 billion project. And they say that's too expensive, right? A $300 billion infrastructure project equivalent is what we embarked on then. And at Easter time, my wife and I took our kids to the Snowy scheme, drove around it, and the actual drive was a bit disappointing. Got to see some dams, etc., but a lot of it's locked off because of the consequences of the bushfires a few years ago. But when we went to Cooma and saw the information centre, they got a great display there. And you can see what an incredible project this is, one of the engineering marvels of the world. And you think, you're looking at this and you're going, imagine the courage and of the visionaries who came up with this idea and saw it through. I can't imagine anyone in Australia capable of that today. But the people who did it were people like Ben Chifley, a humble engine driver, right? Who knew how jobs were important, but it also knew that the way you maintain jobs is they've got to be productive, and you can and you've got to have vision to invest in the country. That's actually what Labor brought to the table when the Labor Party started here, and Labor parties around the world actually. They brought into politics a working man's appreciation of the real world to balance what a lot of these pinstripe suit wearing toffs thought about politics, which was all dominated by money. One of my favourite stories is Keir Hardie, who was the founder of the British Labor Party, this Welsh miner. When he got elected, he was the first Labor man elected to the British Parliament. He turned up in his mining clothes to take his seat. He proudly was not going to put on a top hat and tails and look like the rest of them, right? He knew what he was, and they were that was the British Labor Party. So yeah, anyway, that was that kind of thinking's gone. We've got to bring it back, and we need people out in the real world. And so our party, we call ourselves the Citizens Party because we genuinely believe that if you focus on the real things, there shouldn't be this left-right divide, right? There's a lot more things we can all agree on if we don't get distracted by all the ridiculous stuff, right? So you won't see our party talking much about cancel culture or woke versus anti-woke. We don't buy into that sort of thing. We talk about the things that really benefit all Australians, and we draw our support from across the spectrum. And we've got a few lawyers among our supporters, but very few. They're a necessary evil. But our supporters are the real people of Australia who can, and I've learned a lot from them. I get to know them over time, etc. Their experience, their feedback is informative, and you learn things, and that helps shape your policies as well.
All right. We talk about the big picture stuff, which was originally put forward by Lang Hancock and Jacob Peterson. So for our audience, Lang Hancock was a prospector, a bit like you're a Welsh miner out there in northwest of Western Australia. Comes across a rock and then realises it turns out to be iron ore. And so then we've got a Premier of Queensland who's from the National Party. Well, I have to say, he could actually be a member of this Australian Citizens Party with his long-term vision and perspective of building Queensland. I mean, the way that they structured Queensland, one has to take a leaf out of their book. So we've got this guy in Queensland and we've got the guy in Western Australia, and they put forward a proposal where we've got in this area here, Queensland has coking coal, and which is used with iron ore to make steel. So I just want to bring that awareness to it.
Yep.
But we also have other coal, such as thermal coal and steaming coal, which is used in power generation. So the game plan is to put a rail right across the states of Queensland, Northern Territory, and into West Australia. So where we're up here is usually Port Hedland and Dampier and Cape Lambert, which are the mate, and what's the other one? Hope Prospecting, and of course Island. So those four major ports ship out the iron ore on trains that are over 2 kilometres long. They're taking about 30,000 tonne, I think, from memory. And the game plan was, okay, we've got iron ore here, we've got coal over here. Why don't we transport them across our state? We can put a steel mill in here that would service the Indian Ocean, all those people in the Indian subcontinent, into the Middle East, of course, to Africa, and over here, the Pacific, well, another big major transportation system, and you can make steel. I noticed that in your prospectus there, you're not only talking about having a steel mill here and a steel mill here, you're talking about putting one over here in Mount Isa, and then 2 more along the rail line, obviously to stimulate the Australia's economy. So,
well,
how far down the track are we with that one?
Well, there's a current federal inquiry into this that our party helped support, but Senator Malcolm Roberts from One Nation, Queensland Senator, who opens every statement he makes in Parliament is, as a servant to the people of Queensland and Australia, blah, blah, blah. So Malcolm takes his roles in public service quite seriously, and especially the people of Queensland. So he got the support to get this inquiry up so that this would be seriously considered by the government. And so there's no guarantees coming out of an inquiry, but what I can say is that the Labor senators in the Parliament are participating enthusiastically in this inquiry. They are very much interested in getting this whole thing scoped out because there is still the ones who are participating sort of come from a union transportation background. They actually do still have that real world appreciation. Well, Labor Senator Glenn Sterle was the biggest backer of Malcolm Roberts getting the inquiry up. And Glenn Sterle's a truckie. Right? He was with the Transportation Workers Union, but not just as an activist. He was a truckie. He's driven trucks his whole life. So he has a great sense of this. He's a West Australian senator. He understands the distances. And, yeah, so this will be looked at. I participated in a hearing on Thursday night that was really thorough. This was well presented. A lot of people turned up for that hearing with incredible qualifications. They had experts there in rail building. There was one gentleman there who's built railways in America, the Middle East, Oman, Dubai, these sort of places, right? So he understands rail building in remote areas, etc. They got shipping experts and real shipping experts, ships captains, and all those sort of things. Because with this project, Jeff, is not just the rail side of it, but the project promoters themselves, called East West Line Parks, have developed a concept for a ship that's smaller, that will transport the slab steel that would be produced by these steel mills most efficiently. Because right now, 40% of what is shipped as iron ore to China and Japan and South Korea, and that 40% of that is not iron, right? It's waste. It's essentially something that gets lost in the production, right? But that's weight on the ship. And that's what we do now. We just take the dirt, ship it up there, they make steel, and we get the steel back. So this proposal is to have the steel mills that produce just the first stage of steel, slab steel. The slab steel will get loaded onto these smaller ships, but which are roll-on, roll-off compact ships that can much more efficiently take the slab steel to the big steel mills in Asia and India and all that, etc. Probably Indonesia as well. Down here in Australia, by the way, this will be the biggest. You're talking about dual track, and you're talking about 12,000 kilometers of. Everyone's seen what a rail looks like. It would be 12,000 kilometers of steel to build those 12,000 kilometers. Enough steel to build 12,000 kilometers of rail, right? So it'll be the single biggest steel production job for Australia's existing steel industry in the Illawarra and Whyalla in South Australia. They'll have the building of this will be a huge boom for them, and it just has all these multiplier effects at every stage of it along the construction and then the operation of these things. So this is a really big project. This is visionary. This is nation building. This is the sort of stuff that it'll be much simpler to build than the Snowy Mountain scheme, can I say? But it's starting to get back on that scale. We haven't done anything like this since the Snowy Mountain scheme. And of course, it's called Boomerang because you'll have trains going from Port Hedland to Western Australia, to Queensland, full of iron ore, and they come back full of coal. And they go over full of iron ore and they come back full of coal, right? And feeding the steel mills both ends.
Right. So you mentioned 15% of the GDP was equivalent to $300 billion. How much would this project be?
Well, so there's stages of it, but the minimum project is 80 billion, and that 80 billion. So what the actual consortium behind this is doing, they're asking the government for 320 million for the Australian government to show international investors that this is a serious project, but also to do the initial scoping out, getting permission to build the rail across the land, etc. There's a fair amount of that kind of work. But the 80 billion will be put up by the private sector. And so mainly in the form of going to actual existing steel makers right across the world and offering them the opportunity to build their own steel plant at either end, 1, 2, however many they want, right? So you're talking about sort of like $5 billion for an initial steel plant. So and they're envisaging, I might have these figures wrong, but sort of like 10 either end, that sort of thing, right? Where the big steel maker in Japan had their own initial slab steel production mill in Australia, and the ones in India, etc. Right? So those people will be putting up the bulk of the money. But when the actual rail is built, that will always be an Australian government asset. The rail itself becomes a public asset for all time. The steel mills will be private, the permanent private component to this project. So yeah, $80 billion. But then that's not chump change, of course. But as we discussed before when we talked about war and AUKUS, our government hasn't blinked an eye at signing us up to $360 billion to buy submarines, nuclear submarines, right? Well, if we can contemplate spending that kind of money for instruments of war, why would we choke on investment that's actually going to, preserve Australia's future and give us a better future?
So at the moment, Queensland made $13 billion profit from its royalties on coal. So I assume that the railway being in the public Australian hands, they would be charging a fee for the transportation as an entity, but then the 3 states, Queensland, Northern Territory, and West Australia, would they be putting their hand up for a royalty?
Well, so royalties are par for the course when it comes to the actual extraction of the resource, right? There's always a royalty fee there because that's whoever's using it, that's their access to what is public. We own those resources now. We, the people of Australia, we own those resources. And so if someone wants to use them, well, they've got to pay something. That's what a royalty is. However, what the Queensland government did recently is jack up its royalties. And I mean, I am a Queenslander, by the way. I just live here. I'm not opposed to that because I think there's plenty of examples where royalties are actually really, I think, ridiculously low sometimes. But the reason they did it is a problem. The reason they did it is they're trying to fill a budget black hole. But let me tell you about the difference between, I think they've got their thinking all wrong, right? Because instead of thinking about, we've got these pressing financial problems, where can we get money from? That's where the money is, we're going to extract it from there. That's one way of thinking about the world. The other way of thinking about the world is how do we solve these pressing financial problems in a different way that's actually better for everybody? And the solution there is don't just think of royalties as something to be dug up and shipped out of Australia, because the real money is in the value adding here. That's where the real money is, right? And what we're talking about with Iron Boomerang is the first step of value adding, because the steel, what we will as a country earn from being involved in the production of steel is much greater than you'll get on royalties. So years ago, I read the biography of John Curtin, who was the Prime Minister, Liberal Prime Minister. And my old mate, I got to know Malcolm Fraser. Fraser was his enemy. But anyway, it was a great biography. And I'm reading it, and then there's a detail in there that just blew my mind. Because John Curtin was the Prime Minister who set up the Australian Industrial Development Corporation. And the whole purpose of that was to have an agency like a bank, but more an intermediary that would borrow at the government's credit rating to invest in value-adding industries in Australia. And the big one at the time, Jeff, was bauxite. We had Weipa, the biggest bauxite mine in the world, right? And here's Australia, this massive source of bauxite for aluminium, and we're just the raw materials supplier. So they said, let's invest in smelting. And the AIDC did this. But the cabinet paper that proposed this had figures. And I've memorized them because they just, to this day, I think people need to understand this multiplier effect. So in $1970, 1 million tonne of bauxite that we exported overseas earned us $5 million. That was the total price of bauxite. And the royalty was, of course, a fraction of that. 1 million tonnes earned $5 million. But if we processed it one step into alumina and exported that, we earned $27 million. If we processed it the next step into aluminium and exported that, we earned $120 million. And if we processed it a final step into products, aluminium products, and exported those, we earned $600 million. And that's the difference between the raw material and the finished product. That's how you transform your nation's finances, right? Stop acting like a colony. The colonial system, right? Just pull out the raw material. Stop acting like that. We're a nation. We should be value adding here. And this applies to things like lithium now. It's actually become a big debate around lithium because that's such a huge, we've got plenty of lithium in Australia. That's such a huge issue. But it shouldn't be a debate. It should be a no-brainer. So that's what you would do. That's how you look at a project like this. We're already getting more value from Project Iron Boomerang because we're producing steel from it here than we would from all the royalties we could ever imagine.
So just to give you a heads up there. So if we come back to this thing here, I just want to come back to the royalties. If these three states are all charging a royalty, we still have a bit of a financial problem here, because if it's coming coal out of Queensland going up to Japan or Korea, they're only paying the royalty once, as opposed to being paid 3 times going into the domestic guys.
No, I think I don't think you should. Well, first of all, the territory, I don't think would be. There's no grounds for the territory charging the royalty. The royalty is on when it comes out of the ground. I mean, I'm not an expert in that side of it, but my understanding of royalties, it will still only be once. You pay the royalty when you've on the first transaction after it comes out of the ground. That's the royalty.
Well, the Labor Party tried to set up that rent resources tax in Western Australia, but the mining lobby got right behind it and spent $160 million in advertising, and really nearly took the Labor Party out of the federal sphere, didn't it? So,
well, they did and they didn't. This is the modern Labor Party to me, Jeff. They're afraid of all, not just banks, all corporations, and I think they. So there's two problems. I think my personal view is they could have stood up to the mining companies much more, but I don't think they actually understand economics, to be honest, and what we call physical economy, and again, it was an issue of, well, we just think of these. They're just thinking of these resources as one-dimensional. Oh, they're making. We ship out resources from Australia. They're making more money. Let's tax them more. And I'm saying that's the flawed thinking. They lost that fight. They should have been thinking, why are we just shipping out raw materials? Let's change that, because up until Hawke and Keating and all these reforms they brought in, and including the dismantling of Australian manufacturing, governments didn't think like that. Governments wanted to develop this country. We have degenerated back into a quarry, right? That's what we are, a quarry, and that's what we're.
I mean, John Howard dismantled that. I've listened to you before. The zonal tax rate when you went into out of Mount Isa, or you went into Middle Mount, you're in a different tax rate. And I remember Johnny Howard and Malcolm Fraser going into Middle Mount there, and amongst the unionists at the pub there, and we faced up and said, "No, we're going to take that tax off you, tax incentive."
But look at the town of Middle Mount. Right. This is from a time when you had people like Sir Joe and Charles Court. I mean, they were as pro-mining as anyone's ever existed. But they gave the mining companies conditions. Yeah, go build a mine, but you're going to build a town that's going to have a school and it's going to have a pool, and you're going to make sure the families have a decent life who are working on your mine. And they were hardcore pro-free enterprise guys. They weren't socialists, right? And the people who what's happening now, it just blows my. I got a brother-in-law who drives trains from Townsville out to Mount Isa. He actually dabbled with fly in, fly out to WA. He lasted one round because he's used to being away from his family, but the destructiveness, the social destructiveness of fly in, fly out was appalling to him. There's no way I'm going to be away from my family this long. The money's not worth it. And there's a huge drug problem associated with the people who are flying in and flying out. We never tolerated this once, right? But it's all about we have these incredible resources. We're going to let these global mining companies just extract them on their terms, and we've got to change that. And so Project Iron Boomerang is a good example of that. And can I mention something now about shipping? You and I were talking before.
Before we go there, I mean, we're talking about. I brought up Game of Thrones, but James Cameron brought out a movie called Avatar.
Yeah, that's right.
And the psychological aspect there is the mining company was going for that particular thing, and we saw the whole principle of art imitating life again, isn't it? Yeah.
Yep. That's and it's what happens. I just think I'm appealing to Australians to cast your mind back to remember when we did things differently and ask why. Because there's an assumption for people who don't pay attention to the details of these. Here's what we find as a political party, because we come across lots of issues, right? And what you find with the issues is in every issue, there are people who know that issue and they're real experts. And those people will tell you how wrong the general consensus is, how bad the government decision making is, etc. But the majority of people don't know that because they're not across that particular issue. And even in that, even the experts on one issue are going to be clueless on another issue because they're not experts on it, right? But you learn from those people who are involved in that. And they will tell you about where the bad decision making went on. And what we find is pretty much every issue we're on a downhill slide, bad decision making everywhere. And people, though, assume that there's this thing called progress that just happens, right? That because we've got iPhones now, that somehow that is supposed to represent that our economy is more cutting edge and better. Whereas, yeah, we've got the iPhone, but the industrial capacity that underpins all that has never been weaker because of the consequences of these kind of decisions. We're just saying to people, think back when we thought differently and understand that those people they were pretty smart and they had reasons for the decisions they made to ensure certain standards when it came to provision of services and industry, etc. Right? And they shouldn't be dismissed. So even if you're a Queenslander who is young and is your only view of Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen is just some dottery old fart that was clueless, and Queensland's a funny place because I had someone like Sir Joh, and I heard a former politician the other day making fun of Sir Joh. I just happened to be there when he was, and I'm thinking, you actually have no idea. You don't have to agree with everything Sir Joh did, but you got to look at Queensland and go, why was Queensland so powerful economically, right, compared to a lot of other places? And that's actually one of the reasons why we get on really well. Our party has a good relationship, Jeff, with Bob Katter. Bob Katter has introduced a number of our bills in Parliament, and he's actually going to introduce a bill for a postal bank. But Bob understands this stuff. He was in the Queensland cabinet in the 80s. He was there when they invested in the railway lines that opened up the coal mines in Queensland to make money for the state of Queensland. Right? Bob has a line about the difference between make money and cost money infrastructure. So a football stadium costs money. The Olympic Games that Anastasia wants to do costs money. Make money infrastructure is the railway lines in central Queensland that opened up the mines that is still making money to this day, so that Mr. Dick up there can, in a state of panic, can tap into them for more royalties. That was thanks to Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen and his government back in the 70s and 80s.
Well, he had two things going for him. One, he had some really everyday members of his cabinet from the National Party. But at 10 to 7 on 7, 9 and Channel 10 on a Sunday night, you get a brief 10-minute thing of what's happening with the state of Queensland. You were shown all the different projects that were taking place. This is what we're doing. And then it simplified by saying, count the cranes on the horizon, yeah? Or I'm going to go and feed the chooks, which is his terminology for going out to talk to the journalists. He was this common grounded individual who got the projects going. But more importantly, he tapped into that superannuation. When I say superannuation, when he removed the death duties, people who had properties and built businesses realised, should we migrate to bloody Queensland, our family farm, our family business can stay within our family because we've got no death duties and we can move to Queensland. So he brought entrepreneurial spirit to Queensland. Yeah.
And can I say something about our model of a public bank, though, right? Because Queensland had a state bank, and Sir Leo Hilshire was the head of Queensland Treasury, and he was a giant. Like he's the power behind Sir Joh's throne in a sense, right? He was the guy who made that stuff happen, and they used public investment. But the way it's always worked is if a government's prepared to invest public money in the core infrastructure, that's the seed capital, and that creates the opportunities for the private money to come in and then just flourish, right? But if that public money is not there first, you will get a global mining company say, okay, we're going to go and tap into that mine or whatever, but we're going to do it in the most bare bones way. We're not going to invest in the actual area. We're just going to get in there, rip it out, and leave, right? And that makes money short term, but it doesn't do anything for the state of Queensland long term. And that was the difference. And so that's what we're proposing: get the public investment back. In the inquiry that's running at the moment, Bob Katter's son, Robbie Katter, the state member for Traeger there, his submission to this federal inquiry was about, it's such a desert, it's a credit desert out there in Western Queensland. You actually have to have something like more than 40% deposit if a bank's even going to look at you for buying a house, for lending you money to buy a house out there. They're just not interested. The private banks are not interested in investing in the regional and remote areas of Queensland or anywhere. And so if we just leave investment decisions up to them, we're going to be sitting back and watching the whole of the most productive part of the world wither and die on the vine because no one is prepared to do that. We're reversing that. We're reversing that with a policy of public banking, and projects like Iron Boomerang will take it to another whole new level.
I can also say one of the early days of bringing people together in a socialist capitalist system, I'm going to use those two words, was the use of cooperatives.
Yes.
And how the cooperatives, bigger cooperative down in New South Wales is a living testament, and how farmers and their factories and their world markets have continued to grow and prosper by having farmers on their board.
Yep.
It's a living example. Whereas all the other cooperatives have been hit with, the money men coming in and saying, listen, if you do this and you do that, everybody can have a win-win situation, which has turned to be completely false and fabricated. I remember talking to a member of the Tongan royal family, and the guy said, Dad had these finances come to him and said, listen, we think you could be a major tourist attraction. We'd like to invest in putting an international airport. We'd like to put in accommodation at all different levels, and we'd like to put in a cruise ship terminal. And King said, well, how much is that going to cost us? And they said, nothing. All we want is a 200-kilometre radius for the oil and gas and the fishing. And he said, so that's why you need the airport, that's why you need the accommodation, that's why you need the shipping port to look after all your workers and stuff. So he said, see you later.
Yeah. No, that's beware the carpetbagger, beware the money men coming in. Look, what you just said with co-ops, that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about, right? People need to remember the time we had those and ask yourself why. Because what happened was, you also mentioned earlier AMP. Let's just use the AMP example because that's like a financial co-op, right? Mutual Provident Societies were financial co-ops. And so the members preserved their money, but they also got cheaper financial services, and it worked well for everybody. The value was in the service it provided, and the strength was in the membership. So then they come along and say, hey, you can demutualize and you'll get a board, you'll get shareholders, and they're going to pay you money because you got value in your membership. You can make some money right now here, money in hand. But your management then is not answerable to you, the member. It's answerable to those shareholders. And
True.
Suddenly you've inserted a third entity in that relationship that's there to siphon all the money off. And what's happened to AMP? Right? It was one of the biggest disasters of the Royal Commission. Right? Its abuse of people was appalling. Whereas this was one of the financial cornerstones of Australia, AMP, right? And that's true for the sugar. Most of the sugar industry in Queensland went from co-ops to corporations, sold out to big multinationals, etc. And that great sugar infrastructure in Queensland has never been the same ever since. That's just been repeated across the board, and people assumed at the time that this was progress. And I'm saying to them, like, okay, it's 25, 30 years later. Look back, has it improved? One of the places that's held on to its co-op is the wheat belt of Western Australia. They have this incredible co-op over there called CBH, Cooperative Bulk Handling. And those guys, they've come under enormous pressure to sell out, right, and hand it over to corporate control, and they haven't done it. And God bless them for not doing it. And in fact, we've got to reverse it and bring it back the other way, right? Because all that short-term thinking has been an unmitigated disaster for the country.
So I interrupted you before, but you were going to get onto shipping.
Shipping. Oh, yeah. No, I just think this is great because for the viewers' benefit, Jeff told me before he knows quite a bit about shipping. There's a quote from the around this. To me, this quote sort of epitomizes what went wrong with Australia. So in 2000 or 99 or 2000, 2001, something like that, I forget the exact date, the leader of the National Party was John Anderson. And he gets up in Parliament and the discussion was about shipping. And this was, halfway through or a couple of years into Howard. Well, Howard took over in 96. So, Howard was well and truly established. It was probably his second term, maybe start of his third term. And all that, all the big focus on mining was taken over, et cetera, right? And our manufacturing was being dismantled, and we were turning into this quarry that we just talked about. And John Anderson gets up in Parliament and says, Australia is a shipping nation, not a shipper nation. In other words, we will provide the raw materials to be sent overseas, but we shouldn't have our own shipping line. Right? And this was to me, this epitomizes the kind of attitude that saw us frankly go down the gurgler, because we didn't think like that once before. And so a good side benefit of Project Iron Boomerang will be more shipping in Australia, which we need more shipping. The Senate hearing the other night heard there's only 13 ships registered in Australia now. 13. A decade ago it was like 90, and even that was terrible, right? This was the dismantling of a very important. Here we have so much involvement with the rest of the world, but we don't actually control any of our own shipping to speak of. Whereas once we did, and you'd be familiar, Jeff, with the Australian National Line. We had a government shipping company, right? The Australian National Line. And why did we have a government shipping company? Because the government knew that, hang on, you've got to have capacity. You can let all the private ships come here they want, but you've got to have your own capacity or else you're vulnerable. And that the birth of that shipping line is what proves the case, because it came out of a crisis. And the crisis was World War I. So in World War I, suddenly Britain's at war. We are a source of commodities for Britain, right? Of all, not just mining them, in fact, less mining, much more in the way of foodstuffs, right? Wheat and wool and all that sort of stuff, right? And suddenly there's no ships to come to Australia because Britain's at war. This was a catastrophe. Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister, was in London and realizing, hang on, we have a terrible problem here. How are we going to solve it? And he called up the head of the Commonwealth Bank, and the Commonwealth Bank was brand new. It started in July 1, 1912. So this is like 1914, maybe 1915. So 2 or 3 years into it. Billy Hughes is in London, the Prime Minister. He calls up the head of the Commonwealth Bank, Dennis and Miller, back in Australia, and says, I'm going to go and buy some ships. I need money. And Miller said, no problem. And in fact, just a slight diversion, the year earlier, in 1914, there'd been a financial crisis, a global financial crisis. It was centered in London, total panic everywhere, coinciding with the starting of the war. The only bank in London that didn't shut its doors for a few days during that crisis was the Australian branch of the Commonwealth Bank. Our bank was seen as a rock of stability, a brand new bank owned by the Australian government. It didn't shut its doors in London. And so Miller said to the London office, give the Prime Minister a check or whatever. He went and secretly bought something like 15, 20 ships, something like that. But he had to do it secretly because no one could know that the Australian Prime Minister was in the market for ships, right? And he quickly went, he found these ships, bought them straight away with the money from the Commonwealth Bank. That was the birth of what became the Australian National Line. was called the Commonwealth Shipping Company, or Commonwealth Shipping Line at the time. And it was born out of an emergency because our whole economy depended on being able to supply these commodities to the UK. And suddenly we were totally vulnerable. It was as big a crisis as the first few months of COVID in 2020. In fact, bigger, arguably, for us, right? Talk about a breakdown in supply chains. That's how we solved it. And 100 years later, verified geniuses in the Australian Parliament get up there and go, long-term thinking doesn't matter anymore. Who cares? We know more than those mugs a century earlier. What would they know? Right?
Yep.
That's how we've come to what we're at now. So we can reverse that too, and the Commonwealth Bank, our banking policy would be capable of playing an important role in that.
The issue was A&L had the Darwin Trader and the Bass Trader, and they were row type vessels where you could drive on, drive off, and they were pretty pronounced and sitting up the east coast and across to Darwin, but they could never compete with the backloading of trucks coming out of the north, back down into the Brisbane and down into Sydney. So in the shipping industry, we used to say, well, the roads and all that have been subsidised by the government, so we're not getting subsidised. But in fact, if anything, it was the unions that were the albatross around the neck, because you'd have to have double the crew because you have 6 months on, 6 months off, and the high cost of running ships when you had overseas guys coming in with just the one crew. You just go to the market and just bring in your crew. So we really took a hemorrhaging there, and of course on the waterfront we used to have 16 unions. I mean, I do have to say Bob Hawke did one thing for our industry, and that was when we had the big blow up. I remember one of our ships was in Melbourne, and it was sitting off Moreton Island there for over 17 days before it got a berth. It was principally because it was a rolling strike. So, the Federated Clerks Union might be going out today, so the other unions couldn't turn up and work. So you might have the storeman would go off, or it might be the night watchman. It could be the shift supervisors, crane operators. Each one of those particular individual unions would rolling strike. So then it all became the one union. So, and then it diversified in the fact that you could be employed and placed in any particular role on the terminal. So that was a big, huge shift and change. But now we're seeing the automatic container terminals coming in, and we've seen the reduction of human operators at these terminals. But look, there's been some huge, big shifts, and the other thing is that in the Australian-New Zealand trade lane, where we had Australian and New Zealand shipping operators, the cost, to ship was in the region of $3,500 just to send a 20-foot container from Sydney to Auckland. When if you bought a foreign flag vessel to come in and carry dangerous goods from Brisbane across to Auckland, because those two ports are dangerous ports, then that particular shipping line would have to go and get a single voyage permit, and then have to pay for the crew had to pay the same wages as if it was a Australian or New Zealand seaman. So the costs were quite prohibitive to actually build a great relationship on our international trade lanes. So when we saw the demise of A&L under Australian hands, and it was ended up being sold off, and the French had bought it under CMA CGM banner, we really don't see it anymore. And with the New Guinea trade, when we were more or less looked after New Guinea from Queensland, we had a vessel under the New Guinea Express line called the Sid McGrath. Again, a little row vessel that would go up there and back. We saw the likes of Burns Philp, providing all that trading activities in Papua New Guinea, and we saw people having a go. And then the thing is that I see that why we lost our role as a manufacturing base was when Gough Whitlam introduced the 4 weeks leave with an extra week's leave loading, which then really made it very awkward for businesses to actually carry the burden of having a staff member away for 5 weeks or 4 weeks, but paying them for 5. And so, in order to survive, you actually then outsourced and went to, Taiwan, and you became, just from a manufacturing base, you just became a net importer and a distributor. And that's where we saw the death of our manufacturing industry.
Well,
and then the next bit I want to say is when we went away from having the unions, in the sense that you paid your union memberships and then it went into contract, and then we had the unfair dismissal laws that came in. So 3 strikes and you're out, and you had people there stealing, and then you sack them, and then they'd go to court, and then you spend all your time in court to defend your company. When, if you're a small business, it got to the point that you no longer employed people, which was your major asset, having your own people that you actually employed. You went through an employment agency just to be able to protect yourself. These things need to be removed as well, to allow small business entrepreneurs to build a business into what could be achievable for a 2nd or 3rd generation. But we all know that 3rd generation businesses end up going down the gurgler.
That's probably a Game of Thrones thing too. Well, there's a lot there to comment on. I do think the union movement well and truly lost its way. The union movement created the Labor Party, and they created the Labor Party in the 1890s because they actually had a very insightful understanding that the improved conditions they were fighting for, and they needed to be fighting for them. That was a real, people shouldn't. I don't think people should assume that unions have always been a problem, because we have a living standard today largely thanks to them beginning to fight for this stuff. It was really tough in those days. They went to war in Queensland against the shearers went to war against the
pastoral owners.
They weren't going to war against family farmers. They were going to war against pastoral companies in London who owned the vast tracts of land and sheep stations in Queensland, right? And so anyway, out of that though came the Labor Party, because what the unions disfigured is that, hang on, what we want is what's good for the country as a whole, not just our wages and conditions. Like what can benefit everybody. And to do that, we need a political arm. We need to think about policy, and the Labor Party came out of that, right? And then that thinking led to the Commonwealth Bank, etc. When Labor later on went away from its commitment to standing up to the banks, etc., and the unions, they betrayed the unions in many ways. Labor adopted policies that were anti-working class. The unions became into big finance as well, right? You've got a union movement now, Jeff, that represents fewer workers as a percentage than ever in Australian history, but they've never had more money than ever in Australian history. And that's because they're all part of the superannuation pie. That's
what Paul Keating said. I've given you the money to fight them Tories.
Yeah. Well, and they, trust me, they've become the Tories. I've had direct experience with this in the last few. I've had arguments with union guys who are now super fund managers who sound more like bankers to me than anyone in the Labor Party, right? I'm thinking, who are you people? So the union movement lost its way, and then one of the things that happens is instead of seeing their role as like the conscience of Labor and keeping them honest on commitment to policies that benefit the common person, right? They're sort of overcompensating by this obsession with the bureaucracy and red tape that starts to tie down industry. Though that said, there's a couple of things to consider though, right? Because it's you get a media machine that gets you to focus all on one thing. Look what else happens. So yeah, the unions on the wharfs were notorious, but go and look at the people who have to deal with the wharfs. And I know the New South Wales examples, right? But the truckies now, that go and get those containers off those wharves in New South Wales, it's more expensive than ever.
Correct.
Because what you have is private corporations that put fees on everything, and they're essentially a private tax, and they're taxing everything to death, and they're a monopoly, and no one can avoid them. So at least, can I say something controversial? At least when it was the MUA extracting their pound of flesh from the shipping companies, that money was spent down the local pub and at their local kids' soccer games and whatever, right? Now you've got big corporations that are taking that money out, extracting a pound of flesh from all the transportation industries in Australia and parking it in the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands. That's the difference. And frankly, so I don't think it's an improvement. And what happens is the media focus all on one and they never focus on the other, and so we've got a corporatized system now that's a disaster. And I think it's also true for manufacturing. So, yeah, when they talked about, how expensive it is to manufacture in Australia, well, it always was in a sense because you never wanted to be a third world country in terms of living standards, right? We had a really revolutionary High Court decision in the early 1900s called the Sunshine Harvester case, which said a worker in Australia must be paid a living wage. It was a living wage decision. And a living wage was enough for one wage to sustain a family of 4 or 5. That was a living wage, right? We don't have living wages now by our on paper the wages look higher, but no family in Australia can survive on one wage, right? Sure. Because of everything else. So we were always a higher wage economy thanks to that. The way we made sure we had manufacturing was we had tariffs. And the point of tariffs was to make sure you couldn't be swamped and undercut by people who aren't being paid properly, right? And when they got rid of tariffs, this coincided with and you'd remember this, everyone, all the big corporates couldn't outsource quick enough. Outsourcing became the thing to do, right? Just like demutualizing became the thing to do. Scrapping co-ops became the thing to do. Privatizing became the thing to do. The hallmark of the late 80s and the 90s was outsourcing. And they couldn't do it quick enough, right? And governments encourage that. And that's why we don't have a manufacturing industry. And now they're looking, we were watching it when COVID hit in 2020. Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, said we don't do enough manufacturing in Australia. Everyone in Parliament for that week was making speeches. We've got to manufacture more. Bill Shorten gave a good speech. We've got to manufacture more in Australia. It didn't take Josh Frydenberg a year to backflip and start using the same old language about, no, we don't need to manufacture more. We need to, we've got to focus on our competitive advantage or comparative advantage, basically. And a comparative advantage is this economics concept, which basically says Australia should only focus on extracting raw materials. New Zealand should focus on dairy. China should focus on manufacturing because they got cheap labor. That's comparative advantage. Whereas, again, that's like the cold colonial mentality. We never thought that way once, right? We thought we can do everything here. We once do you remember how many car companies we had at our peak? 6 car makers in Australia at our peak. 6. And what they did, whatever you thought of the value of the quality of their cars, what they did was provide an industrial base that made sure we had one of the highest skilled workforces in Australia, right? Through apprentice, the non-stop conveyor belt of apprenticeships into skilled labor, all of which has been gutted now.
Correct.
So that all that thinking's gone. Bank branches, a little town on the Darling Downs in the 1960s that had 3,000 people in the town and 1,500 people in the region had 6 banks in that town, and they were never charities. They're all there and they're all profitable. And now we're being told by the banks, they want us to believe that they can't sustain one bank in 500 square kilometers. Right? It's just everything's just topsy turvy, and you can deal with every little detail, but you understand that, hang on, there's a way of thinking here that shifted radically. and we've got to take stock of it and say, how do we reverse the things that have clearly gone wrong?
Yeah, I heard you. It's coming up for 1 hour 55 minutes, Robbie. It's been fantastic. I know we could talk on forever, but
no, we better not. I got to go, actually.
Well, Saturday mornings, yeah, it's bloody Dad's taxi, and you got to pay the McDonald's for the kids.
Yeah. That's why I laughed at that. That is exactly what happens.
Yeah. Do you like being called Robbie or Robert? So on your profile, that's Robert.
Robbie to my friends, and I try and be friends with everyone.
Yeah. Very good. Is there any question I should have asked you, or something that you wanted to speak about?
Oh no, no, we can't. No, we will. I think we've covered it all. Pay attention to Jan's campaign. A little bit disappointing that she's once again part of a Melbourne Cup field. These by-elections. Sometimes you get lucky and you're one of 6 or 7 candidates. Unfortunately, when you've got 13 candidates, you can get lost. But no one's going to do what Jan does, and I think her message is quite unique. And I would urge people, whoever's in Fadden and listening to this, when you think about voting, just don't think of it as a wasted vote. You control your preference. So, if you have a preference between Liberal, Labor, vote them second. Never vote for your major party preference first, and then vote for the interesting minor party second, because that's a total wasted vote, and it'll never get to them. Do it the opposite way. Vote for, if you like what we've said today, and you want to help Jan make a splash, vote 1 for Jan. That also means the Labor and Liberal Party don't get money for their vote. They won't get any money for their vote. They want you to just assume they should get the money and vote 1 for them. They get $2 a vote, right? So vote 1 for Jan. Vote for Labor or Liberal second or third, or wherever you want to preference it. And what that will mean is that the people in those 2 parties will realise, if Jan gets enough votes that way, they'll realise, well, there are people in that electorate who actually like the idea of a postal bank. They like that. They don't like the idea of war. Maybe we need to pay attention to those issues, and that's how you can not just get attention for the issues, but start to shift the thinking of the people in the major parties. So that's what I'd say for the locals who might be listening in terms of the by-election.
Oh, very good. I appreciate Ian Oliver reaching out and having that conversation. So, bloody brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the service you provide.
You're very welcome. All right. Love you. And
thanks, mate.